What happens to a town built entirely around a single industry when that industry decides it doesn't need the town anymore? Corby knows. On 10th April 1979, British Steel Corporation announced the closure of its steelworks in Corby, Northamptonshire. Not a gradual wind-down, not a restructuring, a complete shutdown. Within months, 5,800 jobs vanished. In a town of 49,000 people, that meant 1 in 3 households lost their primary income overnight. The steelworks had been Corby's reason for existing. The town hadn't grown organically over centuries. It had been manufactured, designed, engineered into existence by a single company for a single purpose: to turn Northamptonshire ironstone into steel. When that purpose ended, the question became urgent and terrifying. What was Corby for? The steel furnaces stood on a 480-acre site between Great Oakley and Little Oakley, dismantled between 1981 and 1983. The cooling towers came down in controlled explosions. People brought their children to watch. Some cried. Most stood silent, watching a century collapse in 17 seconds. Let's start with money, because money explains most of what happened, even if it doesn't justify it. In 1978, British Steel Corporation posted losses of £443 million. That's roughly £2.8 billion in today's money. The company was hemorrhaging cash across multiple sites: Port Talbot, Scunthorpe, Teesside, Ravenscraig, Corby. The government, Jim Callaghan's Labour government, facing an IMF loan and inflation at 8.3%, demanded cuts. Ian McGregor, chairman of BSC from 1980, had a reputation for brutal efficiency. He'd already restructured British Leyland. He knew how to close factories. Corby's problem was geological. The Northamptonshire ironstone that the works depended on was low-grade ore, around 30% iron content compared to 60 to 65% for imported Swedish ore. Processing it required more coal, more time, more labor. In 1960, that hadn't mattered. Britain had cheap coal and expensive imports. By 1979, North Sea oil had changed the currency markets, making imports cheaper. Simultaneously, Corby's ore reserves were depleting. The open-cast quarries around Great Oakley were exhausted. Deeper mining would cost millions. The steelworks produced 1.2 million tons of steel per year in its final years, mostly tube steel, pipes for oil rigs, construction, infrastructure. But it was expensive steel. BSC's economists calculated that every ton of Corby steel cost £47 more to produce than steel from Port Talbot or imported from Germany. With 1.2 million tons annually, that's a £56.4 million disadvantage. The works couldn't compete. McGregor's recommendation was clinical: close Corby, consolidate production at 5 sites instead of 13, cut the national workforce from 166,000 to 100,000. The savings would be immediate. The social cost would be someone else's problem. On 10th April 1979, the announcement came. No consultation, no warning. Workers arrived for the morning shift and found union representatives waiting at the gates with leaflets. Corby Steelworks to close. Production would continue for 18 months whilst existing orders were fulfilled. After that, nothing. The financial logic was irrefutable. The human logic was catastrophic. Who were the people who made Corby steel? Mostly they were Scottish. Between 1932 and 1939, Stewart's and Lloyd's, the company that built the steelworks, recruited 6,000 workers directly from Scotland's declining shipyards and coal mines. They came from Glasgow, Lanarkshire, Ayrshire, Fife. Entire streets in Corby were named after Scottish towns: Callander, Bannockburn, Howick, Glencoe. The local accent was a bizarre hybrid. Northamptonshire vowels mixed with Glaswegian consonants. People called it Corby Scots. James McAvoy, aged 28 in 1934, left Coatbridge with his wife Ellen and 4 children. He'd worked in steel since he was 14. The journey south took 14 hours by train. Stewart's and Lloyd's had promised jobs, housing, and a future. They delivered prefabricated houses on the edge of the works, built in rows like Monopoly pieces. Rent was deducted directly from wages, £1 and 7 shillings per week. McAvoy worked in the blast furnace. Temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Celsius. The noise was constant, industrial, deafening, a roar that never stopped day or night. Workers developed their own sign language because shouting was useless. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days one week, 5 the next. Wages in 1935 were £3 and 10 shillings. By 1978, a furnace man earned £87 per week. Not spectacular, but reliable. Enough for a mortgage, a car, a holiday in Skegness. The work required skill. Charging the furnace, loading the correct ratio of ore, coke, and limestone was an art learned over years. Tapping the furnace, releasing molten iron at 1,300 degrees required precision timing. Mistakes killed people. In 1957, a furnace explosion killed 3 men. Robert Cunningham, age 41, Thomas O'Brien, age 38, William Fraser, age 52. Their names are on a memorial stone outside what used to be the main gates. By 1979, the average Corby steelworker was 47 years old with 23 years of service. Many had never worked anywhere else. Their fathers had worked there. Their sons were apprentices there. When the closure was announced, union representatives tried to calculate retraining options. What do you retrain a 53-year-old blast furnace man to do? Drive a taxi? Stack shelves? Work security? The answer for most was nothing. They took redundancy payments, £3,000 to £8,000 depending on length of service, and never worked again. Corby didn't exist before steel. That's not an exaggeration. In 1930, Corby was a village of 1,500 people surrounding a Norman church, fields, farms, a pub called the Gridiron. By 1939, it was a town of 15,000. By 1961, 38,000. By 1979, 49,000. The steelworks shaped everything. The town's layout radiated outward from the works like a solar system. Housing estates, Lloyd's, Hazel, Kingswood, Danesholm, Beanfield. Each one built in a specific decade to house a specific wave of workers. Roads were named after steel executives: Lloyd Street, Stewart Avenue. The town hall, opened in 1966, was built with steel girders forged on site. Even the landscape was industrial. The quarries left scars, vast pits filled with water, now called Corby's Lakes by optimistic estate agents. Slag heaps formed artificial hills. The largest, called the Ironstone Hill, was 60 meters high. Children sledged down it in winter. The air smelled of iron oxide and coal smoke. Washing hung outside turned gray within hours. People accepted it. That was the smell of employment. The works operated continuously. 3 shifts, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The town's rhythm matched the shift changes. Buses ran every 20 minutes. The co-op on Elizabeth Street opened at 5:30 a.m. to sell cigarettes and newspapers to night shift workers finishing up. Pubs had special licenses. Steel workers could drink at 7 a.m. because, for them, it was evening. When the closure came, the rhythm broke. Shift changes stopped. Buses ran empty. The co-op reverted to normal hours. The pubs lost their early licenses. The town felt wrong, like a clock running backwards. The demolition began in 1981. The blast furnaces went first, cut apart with oxyacetylene torches. The steel was sold as scrap, most of it shipped to India and South Korea, countries that were now making steel cheaper than Britain. The main rolling mill, a cathedral-sized structure with a roof 400 meters long, was dismantled piece by piece. It took 18 months. Workers who'd spent 30 years building steel now spent 18 months watching it get taken apart. By 1983, the site was flattened. Concrete foundations remained, too expensive to remove. Grass grew through the cracks. For a decade, it was wasteland, fenced off, dangerous. Kids broke in to explore the ruins, searching for souvenirs, bolts, tools, fragments of steel. Nobody agrees who killed Corby Steel. That's the thing about industrial collapse. There are always multiple culprits, and everyone blames someone else. Labor blamed Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister on the 4th of May, 1979, 3 weeks after the closure announcement. But the decision had been made under Callaghan's government. Thatcher simply refused to reverse it. Her ideology was clear. Loss-making state industries should be closed or privatized. Steel was loss-making. Therefore, steel should be cut. But Thatcher's government accelerated the cuts. In 1980, BSC announced 52,000 additional redundancies across the UK. A national steel strike began on 2 January 1980, lasting 13 weeks. It was bitter, violent at times. Picket lines in Corby blocked lorries leaving the works. Police were bussed in from Leicestershire and Bedfordshire. Arrests were made. The strike ended on 3 April with minimal concessions. The closures continued. The unions blamed management. Bill Sears, General Secretary of the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation, called BSC's strategy managed decline disguised as modernization. He argued that investment, not closure, was the answer. Upgrade the Corby furnaces, import higher-grade ore, install continuous casting technology. The works could be profitable. BSC's response was damning. It would cost £185 million to modernize Corby. For that price, they could expand Port Talbot instead, which had better infrastructure, deeper harbors, and cheaper Welsh labor. Corby's location, landlocked in Northamptonshire, 60 miles from the nearest port, was a fatal disadvantage. Some blamed Europe. Britain's entry into the EEC in 1973 had exposed British steel to European competition. German steelmakers, heavily subsidized by their government, could undercut British prices. French steel, Italian steel, Spanish steel, all flooding the market. Britain's industrial protections evaporated. Others blamed globalization more broadly. South Korea's POSCO, established in 1968, was producing steel at a fraction of British costs. Japanese steel, Brazilian steel, Indian steel. The entire global market had shifted. Britain's post-war dominance, when it produced 20% of the world's steel, was over. By 1979, that figure was 4%. Locally, people blamed Stewart's and Lloyd's for selling out. In 1967, S&L merged with other companies to form British Steel Corporation. The merger was supposed to create efficiencies. Instead, it created a bureaucracy. Decisions about Corby were made in London by executives who'd never visited Northamptonshire. The personal connection, the paternalistic capitalism that S&L had practiced, vanished. The truth is, everyone was right. Corby died because of geology, economics, politics, globalization, and corporate indifference. The steelworkers understood this. They weren't naive. They knew cheap imports and expensive ore made their jobs vulnerable. What enraged them was the speed. No transition plan. No investment in alternatives, just closure. What happened to Corby after steel? Unemployment reached 30% by 1981. For men aged 50 to 60, it was closer to 70%. The government offered retraining schemes, computer programming, welding, HGV licenses. Most steelworkers ignored them. Programming required maths and English qualifications they didn't have. Welding jobs didn't exist. HGV licenses cost £800, more than their redundancy payments could stretch to. Some moved. Approximately 2,000 former steelworkers relocated to other BSC sites, Scunthorpe, Port Talbot, Ravenscraig. But this required uprooting families, selling houses in a collapsed market, and starting over in towns that didn't want incomers taking their jobs. Most stayed. The town council, controlled by labor, launched a regeneration strategy. The plan was to attract light industry, electronics, assembly, warehousing, to replace steel. They designated Corby an enterprise zone in 1981, offering tax breaks and relaxed planning regulations. It worked, partially. Weetabix built a factory. RS Components opened a distribution center. Golden Wonder moved crisp production from Scotland. But these jobs paid less. A Weetabix production worker earned £4.50 per hour in 1985, £180 per week compared to the £450 per week a steelworker had earned. The jobs were also less secure. No unions, no pensions, no sense of permanence. The psychological damage was worse than the economic damage. Steelworkers had identified themselves through their work. I'm a furnaceman. I'm a roller. I work steel. When the steel went, so did their identity. Depression rates soared. The Corby Health Center reported a 40% increase in patients presenting with anxiety and depression between 1980 and 1983. Alcoholism became endemic. The town had always had a drinking culture. Shift work and hard labor demanded it. But after closure, drinking became destructive. Suicide rates increased. Between 1979 and 1985, Corby's male suicide rate was 23.4 per 100,000, almost double the national average of 12.7. The local newspaper, the Evening Telegraph, stopped reporting them after a while. Too many, too depressing. Domestically, families fractured. Marriages collapsed under financial pressure. Fathers who defined themselves through providing became dependent on their wives' wages, cleaning jobs, care work, part-time retail. The gender dynamics of working-class masculinity, built around being the breadwinner, inverted overnight. Many men couldn't cope. The younger generation suffered differently. School leavers in 1980 to 1985 entered a labor market with no opportunities. The steelworks had always been the default. Leave school at 16, start an apprenticeship, earn a trade. Now there were no apprenticeships. Youth unemployment in Corby hit 48% in 1983. Boredom, anger, and hopelessness mixed dangerously. Crime increased, burglaries, car theft, vandalism. The police reported a 60% increase in property crime between 1980 and 1984. It wasn't organized crime, it was desperation. People stealing to survive, or stealing because they'd given up on legitimate routes to dignity. Here's something the closure announcements never mentioned. The steelworks left poison behind. For decades, Corby's steelworks had scattered dust across the town. Iron oxide, manganese, chromium, lead. It settled on roofs, gardens, playgrounds. Nobody worried. Dust was normal. It meant industry, employment, prosperity. But in the 1980s, doctors began noticing a pattern. Babies born in Corby between 1979 and 1984 had significantly higher rates of limb deformities, missing fingers, underdeveloped arms, club feet. The rate was 3 times the national average. Parents organized. In 1997, 18 families filed a lawsuit against Corby Borough Council, alleging that toxic waste from the steelworks demolition had caused birth defects. The case took 12 years. In 2009, the High Court ruled in favor of the families, confirming that the council's mishandling of contaminated soil during demolition had exposed pregnant women to teratogens. The council paid compensation, £3 million divided amongst the families, but the ruling was narrow. It didn't address the decades of industrial pollution before demolition, only the specific mishandling during cleanup. Hundreds of other families received nothing. The contamination was extensive. Soil samples taken in 2005 found lead concentrations of 1,200 parts per million in residential gardens, 4 times the safe limit. Chromium, arsenic, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons were present across the former steelworks site and surrounding areas. The council's response was to cap the contamination, literally cover it with clean soil. Between 2000 and 2010, thousands of tons of topsoil were imported and spread across Corby. Parks, playing fields, housing estates. The poison is still there, just buried. Nobody talks about it. Estate agents certainly don't mention it. This is the invisible legacy of industrial collapse. The jobs vanish, the buildings get demolished. But the toxins remain literally in the ground, shaping lives for generations. Corby in 2024 is a town that still doesn't know what it is. The population has grown, 68,000 people, but that growth is deceptive. It's not prosperity, it's affordable housing. Corby is one of the cheapest places to live within commuting distance of London. The railway station, reopened in 2009 after being closed in 1966, runs direct trains to St. Pancras in 67 minutes. People buy houses in Corby for £180,000 and commute to jobs in London. But these new residents don't integrate. They're called DFLs, down from London, by locals. They don't drink in Corby's pubs. They don't send their children to Corby's schools. They live parallel lives, using Corby as a bedroom, not a community. The old steelworkers' families remain, but their children have mostly left. University, the armed forces, jobs elsewhere, anything to escape. The ones who stayed are trapped in low-wage service jobs. The town center is dominated by bookmakers, payday loan shops, and charity stores. The unemployment rate is 6.8%, higher than the national average of 4.2%. The steelworks site is unrecognizable. Earlstree's industrial estate hosts 47 companies, logistics firms, packaging companies, a bakery, a frozen food distributor. The largest employer is Corby Borough Council itself, administrators, social workers, planners trying to manage decline. There is no memorial to the steelworks, no museum, no preserved blast furnace or rolling mill. The town council discussed it in 1995, but decided it was too expensive. A small plaque exists near the Corby Cube. Stewart's and Lloyd Steelworks, 1932 to 1980. 50 words, that's it. Some of the street names remain: Bessemer Close, Foundry Road, Ironstone Lane. Ghosts of industry embedded in geography. Children growing up on these streets have no idea what the names mean. They've never seen steel made. They've never heard a blast furnace roar. Corby's industrial identity is fading from lived memory. The few remaining steelworkers, now in their 70s and 80s, meet occasionally at the ex-steelworkers social club on Rockingham Road. Fewer than 30 members remain. They drink, share stories, and argue about what went wrong. Some still blame Thatcher. Others blame the unions for striking instead of negotiating. Most just shrug. It's history. It's over. But it's not over. Not really. Corby's problems, chronic unemployment, poor health outcomes, educational underachievement, trace directly back to 1979. The town has never recovered. It has adapted, survived, persisted. But recovered? No. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Corby was always temporary. The steelworks existed because Northamptonshire had ironstone. When the ironstone ran out, the steelworks was doomed. No amount of political will or union militancy could change geology. The ore was low-grade and finite. The works should have closed in 1965. It survived another 15 years through subsidies, inertia, and political fear of unemployment. But closing Corby didn't save British Steel. BSC continued losing money. Ravenscray closed in 1992. Consett closed in 1980. Ebby W. Vale closed in 2002. The entire British steel industry contracted. By 2000, the UK produced 15 million tons of steel annually, down from 28 million in 1970. By 2020, it was 7 million tons. British Steel Corporation was privatized in 1988, sold to private investors for £2.5 billion. It merged with a Dutch company to become Corus in 1999. Corus was acquired by India's Tata Steel in 2007 for £6.2 billion. Today, what remains of British Steel is owned by Jingi Group, a Chinese conglomerate. The Corby story is the story of post-industrial Britain. Industries that defined regions, provided identities, and sustained communities were allowed to collapse because they were no longer profitable. The human cost was dismissed as regrettable but necessary. Regeneration efforts were half-hearted. The workers and their families were abandoned. And now, the UK imports 65% of its steel. During the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war, when global supply chains seized, Britain realized it had outsourced critical industrial capacity, steel for infrastructure, defense, construction, all dependent on foreign suppliers. The very logic that justified closing Corby, cheaper to import, suddenly seemed short-sighted. But reopening Corby's steelworks is impossible. The site is buried under warehouses. The skills are lost. The workers are dead or retired. You cannot resurrect an industry once you've killed it. 3 things remain from Corby's steel era. First, the people. The descendants of Scottish steelworkers still live in Corby, still speak with that hybrid accent, still carry the memory of what their grandfathers built. They're proud, even in decline. They remember when Corby mattered. Second, the landscape, the quarry lakes, the flattened slag heaps, the contaminated soil, the physical evidence of industry slowly being erased by nature and development. In 50 years, even this will be gone. Third, the question. What happens to a town built around a single industry when that industry vanishes? Corby answered it with unemployment, poverty, contamination, and slow, grinding adaptation. Other towns are answering it now. Car manufacturing towns facing electrification, coal towns facing decarbonization, oil towns facing renewable energy. Corby's tragedy wasn't unique. It was just early. The steelworks closed 45 years ago. Nobody under 50 remembers it operating. Soon, nobody will remember it at all. Corby will become just another Midlands town with cheap housing and good train links. The steel will be forgotten, except by the people who lived it. And they're dying.